Welcome to the 64th A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts. In this six-part lecture series, entitled Restoration as Event and Idea, Art in Europe, 1814 to 1820, art historian Thomas Crow will consider the period following the fall of Napoleon. During this time, artists throughout Europe were left uncertain and adrift, with old certainties and boundaries dissolved. How did they then set new courses for themselves? Professor Crow's lectures answer that question by offering both the wide view of art centres across the continent, Rome, Paris, London, Madrid, Brussels, and a close-up focus on individual actors, Francisco Goya, Jacques-Louis David, Antonio Canova, Sir Thomas Lawrence, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and Théodore Géricault. Whether directly or indirectly, these artists were linked in a new international network with changed artistic priorities and new creative possibilities emerging from the wreckage of the old. In this third lecture, entitled Cut Loose, 1815 to 1817, Napoleon returns, David crosses borders, and Géricault wanders outcast Rome, originally delivered at the National Gallery of Art on March 29, 2015, Professor Crow examines the displaced and wandering existences of David and Géricault, both in geographical and psychological exile, during which each was forced to re-examine and reconfigure the fundamentals of his artistic life.
Well, once again, thank you very much for coming to the lecture on this Sunday afternoon, and I want to extend my thanks in that regard to the people who are watching on the simulcast. I've had fantastic communications from people who have watched it that way or on the podcast that comes later in the week, and feel very privileged to be the first of these lecturers to be presented with that kind of outreach. And hope that the unfolding of the momentum of the restoration story today rewards the time and attention you are putting into watching. Roller coaster might be too playful a term for the events that followed the late autumn of 1814, where we left the young Théodore Géricault in the last lecture. Both a mounted royal musketeer and the author of the monumental pairing of the charging Chasseur de la Garde and the wounded cuirassier in the Paris Salon exhibition of 1814, the first under the return of the monarchy. The light cavalryman versus the heavy, troubled defiance versus resigned surrender, each of the horses bearing the load of emotion suppressed in the faces of the riders. Before Géricault undertook the second canvass, as we noted in the last lecture, he'd enlisted as a cavalryman in the Royal Guard, but further finished work like this mounted hussar in the Clark Art Institute afterwards becomes relatively scarce and generally small in scale. So we could confer that the artist's duties in the Royal Guard had become more consuming, and all thought of avocational artistic pursuits vanished entirely in February 1815, when news reached Paris of Bonaparte's escape from captivity on the Mediterranean island of Elba. With a small force, the former emperor had landed at Antibes on the south coast of France and immediately began making his way up the valley of the Rhone, converting to his cause all the ostensibly royalist troops and commanders sent out to block him, the scene as later imagined by military specialist Charles de Steuben. Even the king's brother, Le Comte d'Artois, sent out to confront Napoleon, simply abandoned the field at Lyon. Having cashiered so many able officers, Louis XVIII, despite the flourish of that personal cavalry, found himself with no effective defenses nor the personal courage to rally support against Napoleon's return. As Bonaparte was preparing to enter Paris from Fontainebleau, Géricault and his company were summoned in the night to accompany this just restored king on a furtive flight across the Netherlandish border to an ignominious exile in Ghent. The unfortunate Antoine-Jean Gros, in this monumental and now ruined canvas representing Louis XVIII bidding farewell to his household in the Tuileries Palace, Gros found himself compelled to celebrate the ignominious royal retreat as some form of heroism. These were the depths to which official restoration art could descend. So after departing the Tuileries, the king's nocturnal column disintegrated under an incessant downpour, dogged by lancers loyal to Bonaparte. Géricault found himself among those riders effectively deserted by the king rather than the other way around. He was hastily dismissed from service along with his brother officers, while the monarch struggled on with only a tiny entourage. Géricault and his companions were left to abandon the sodden ruins of their splendid uniforms and tack, each to make his own way in shabby civilian disguise. Géricault himself dressed himself as a teamster in order to make his escape. In a decree of the previous March, at the time of his re-accession to the emperor's throne, Napoleon had forbidden any members of the royal companies from residing in or near Paris. So Géricault, fearing retribution should he reveal himself there, made himself exceedingly scarce, perhaps hiding out with family in Normandy, or maybe just going to ground in his studio in the Rue des Martyrs. In any event, no one seems to know where he kept himself over the next 3 months. When Louis XVIII returned as the pawn of the victorious Duke of Wellington at the end of June 1815, Géricault stayed away from any renewed or further military service. No longer the widely acclaimed harbinger of peace of his first restoration, the king now unleashed a harsh return to arbitrary authoritarian rule in his second restoration. The royal family and their entourage determined to efface as many of the changes wrought by revolution and empire as they could possibly accomplish. While Géricault's record in the Royal Guard meant that he had nothing personally to fear, the same did not apply to Jacques-Louis David, who had not only famously served and celebrated Napoleon, but in his days as a revolutionary deputy had voted for the execution of Louis XVI as the older brother of the current ruler you're looking at the moment. Within days of the news from Waterloo of Napoleon's defeat there reaching Paris, David made a request for a passport that would allow his crossing the border into Switzerland. Under the circumstances, it's difficult to credit David's explanation that his apparent flight had been no more than a voyage pittoresque, long in the planning. But he made good on that promise by replenishing, in the course of his travels, the stock of drawings that I spent so much time at the end of last lecture discussing. Accompanied only by a servant named Geoffroy, he crossed the border on the road to Lausanne and circled the lake to Geneva, and back across the modern French border to the villages of the valley of Chamonix below Mont Blanc, stopping, as you see here, to record the vistas along the way. But he continued to have the classics on his mind, producing a succession of improvised studies that appear to point both back toward his own past and forward to some future, some unexampled repertoire of subjects that he could make his own. This sheet promises, but doesn't quite deliver, a ritual procession of maidens with some sacrifice suggested, as that figure on the left mounts the step bearing some kind of offering. David's thoughts were sufficiently developed, whatever the theme, that he experimented turning the centrally seated figure there, turning her face from a downward regard in the direction of the viewer to a melancholy profile, or vice versa. More worked out, but still elusive in its theme, is this sketch of a languishing young male lover. I take that from the weeping Cupid in the bottom right, about to be ministered some potion or some poison by this hovering female nurse or sorceress. This sheet features a recognizable mythic motif, immediately recognizable, as Leda ravished by Zeus in the guise of a swan. But David sets it in something like the same alpine valleys through which he was then traveling. Along with such compact compositions as these last two, other pages present looser arrays of figures, the most intriguing of which includes a denser overlapping group on the right-hand side, and also includes an ominously resonant caption in David's hand across the upper right, these condemned ones adorned with flowers. Now, as we had a chance to explore in the last lecture, a young student in Rome is keen to gather a whole repertoire of possible types, poses, gestures, expressions, motifs, while he has this precious time in the, cradle of European civilization. Here in the upper left are two sheets we saw from David's own youthful albums, accompanied in the lower right by the sort of landscapes he was also gathering in Rome. But in other respects, landscapes are rare in David's work overall, so the Alpine sojourn introduces a fresh, new sense of observation of his surroundings. In the drawings from that hasty Swiss sojourn, David seems to have begun a process akin to that of an eager student in his academic days in Rome, but doing it late in life, using his reserves of memory and imagination, starting with known narrative groupings, then freely mixing and reassembling them into new situations and stories that extended his imaginative reach outside of the inherited repertoire of themes dissipated by classical texts and by classical monuments. During his travels, David kept up a clandestine correspondence with his wife in Paris, still in Paris, under the name Monsieur and Madame Geoffroy, adopting as a nom de voyage the name of his servant. Madame David, born Marguerite Charlotte Pécule, is the subject of this portrait by her husband here in the gallery, which was composed just 2 weeks before. And after having had some turmoil earlier in their marriage, during this time of stress and facing the prospect of exile, they seem to have bonded much more closely again. By early August, word reached him as he circled back to Geneva that the fears behind his first panicked flight seemed not to have been borne out by events, and that it seemed safe to return to Paris. But he remained wary nonetheless. Thanks to the favorable intervention of an Austrian diplomat, his passport was finally delivered at Besançon, but he was so anxious to escape his military custody that he set out under the cover of darkness at 3 a.m. on the same night. Once reinstalled in Paris, he kept to a quiet life for the remainder of 1815, as the policy of the restored monarchy towards those who had played prominent roles in the revolution and empire gradually took shape. In mid-January of 1816, the ambiguity came to an end. All regicides, that is, those deputies who had voted for the death of Louis XVI, were to be permanently banished from France. David's request to the authorities that he be allowed passage to Switzerland or to Italy were denied. Just 11 days later, he and his wife had arrived at their final permanent home, the exterior of which is still extant, in Brussels. Dominating their new quarter was the principal theater of Brussels for opera and drama, le Théâtre de la Monnaie, so called because it stood on the location of a former mint. You see here the facade as it existed in 1816 when the Davids settled into their house just behind it. Now, the reason there are very few reproductions of this structure, this is about the best I could find, is that it was demolished in 1818 at the end of the construction of a new Théâtre de la Monnaie. And the former building being razed to the ground in order to create the plaza in front of it, the Place de la Monnaie, which exists like this today. The Davids certainly lived with a good deal of noise and disruption during their first Brussels years, therefore, their house being just behind the far corner of the new structure, roughly indicated by the blue arrow that I've put in. That high arched door leads into an interior courtyard. Now, David and his family were not the only ones anticipating this outcome and considering the painter's options. Here is a portrait of David in the first blush of his new life in exile, the work of his very accomplished Belgian pupil, François-Joseph Navez, about whom we'll hear considerably more in the last two lectures. And in the spring of 1816, just within weeks of their having resettled in Brussels, David received a letter from Alexander von Humboldt, no less, the naturalist and famous explorer of South America. And here is his self-portrait of 1814, which kind of starts off a little portrait gallery we're going to go through as we assemble these various actors European-wide around David's new life. The letter, conveyed by the younger von Humboldt, contained a message from his brother Wilhelm von Humboldt, his near equal in European fame, who led the Prussian delegation to the Congress of Vienna, where the victorious allies were hammering out the post-Napoleonic settlement for Europe. It proposed that David would emigrate to Prussia, where he would be appointed court painter to King Friedrich Wilhelm and oversee, quoting from the offer, the establishment of a new museum and the advancement of studies in all branches of the arts and drawing. End quote. Now, for me, this initiative points to the ways in which culture was coming to be conceived on a European rather than a parochially national scale. It also demonstrates the ways that artistic matters frequently confounded the divisions and fault lines of political affairs. In this case, the Prussians had been the most punitive in their attitudes and behavior toward the French, or were being that, during the Allied occupation of the French capital. The most vociferous in expressions of emerging German nationalism, the architects of the final coalition that brought down Napoleon, as well as being the fiercest auxiliaries to Wellington in the Allied victory at Waterloo. The brothers Humboldt, on the other hand, can be said to have led Europe intellectually, Wilhelm being an eminent linguist and architect of the Prussian educational system, a worldwide model, which included his founding of the University of Berlin. Alexander, here in the famous portrait by Weitsch, had been mostly resident in Paris since returning from his expeditions in 1804, receiving a kind of acclaim that I think I can only compare to that met Charles Lindbergh in the early 20th century. And thereafter, he dedicated himself to publishing the first comprehensive scientific accounts of South American geology, zoology, and botany, avidly consumed, if not always read and understood, by a broad, educated audience across Europe. When David refused the Prussian offer on stated grounds of his wife's health, the offer was reiterated by an undeterred Chancellor von Hardenberg, seen as portrayed by Weitsch in full Restoration glory. And he offered a new promise to David, that this position would carry ministerial rank in Prussia, so thereafter the borders of France would be open to him again. But this full court press proved to be of no avail. David wrote to one pupil in very ominous terms toward the end of June as these negotiations were reaching their conclusion, enjoining him to total discretion regarding this correspondence, silence, David orders, and contempt. And to another correspondent, he stated more forthrightly, quote, "I do not want to use my brush to recall the reverses and misfortunes of my country." When an intermediate conveyed an offer to paint the Duke of Wellington, as Goya, in fact, had just done, David replied, "I have not waited 70 years to defile my brush. I would rather cut off my hand than paint an Englishman." Either the experience of defeat had reversed the easygoing commerce that David had enjoyed with Lord Douglas over the commissioning of Napoleon in his study, about which you've heard a good deal, or, as is likely, David drew a hard and fast distinction between celebrating a French subject for a British client and doing the same for an enemy sitter. So Brussels it was, and would remain for the remainder of his life, nearly a decade. His arrival at this address preceded by only a few months the unification of what we today know as Belgium with the northern Dutch provinces under a newly created Kingdom of the Netherlands, the larger polity, which was sort of hammered together by the Allies as a post-Waterloo bulwark against traditional French territorial designs in the Low Countries. Despite these geopolitical origins, though, its newly entitled monarch, William I, former Prince of Orange, showed himself hospitable to the French regicide exiles, generosity for which the humbled artist praised him publicly, as we will hear later on. And we see William I in a ceremonial portrait of 1817 painted by one of David's own pupils, Joseph Poulenc. Now, David had been able to bring a number of treasured artworks with him to his new home, but the great albums containing the thousands of studies made in Rome did not make the trip. We will trace in the fifth lecture how he rebuilt in relative isolation a new and pretty radical artistic foundation from drawn studies. You see a selection of them here, which were projected like those in the Swiss sketchbook from his own memory and imagination. But there is some other ground to cover before we get there. Terrain also best mapped by another cycle of astonishing drawings. At this juncture, 1816 emerges as the year of wandering, not only for the reluctant exiled David at the age of 66, but for the rudderless Géricault at the age of 25. Here, his likeness from this time captured by his friend, the lithographer Alexandre Collin. Belatedly setting his sights on the journey to Rome that had been lately denied to David, Géricault enrolled in the competition for the Academy's Grand Prix for 1816, the winner of which was accorded a 3-year residence in the French Academy at Rome, an institution enviably located since Napoleon's conquest of the city in the Villa Medici on the Pincian Hill, next to the Church of Trinità dei Monti and backing onto the Borghese Gardens, as seen in the middle ground of this 1809 landscape by Granet. That precious French possession survived the fall of empire and indeed flourishes to this day. Now, there's a persistent narrative among older art historians, beginning with Géricault's 19th century biographer, Charles Clément, that yearns to normalize Géricault. His submitting himself to the Rome Prize competition is thus seen as a stage in his maturation toward a classical outlook, spurring him to acquire the skills and models that a Roman residence would provide. Notwithstanding the fact that Géricault would never have been permitted to win the Grand Prix, not without an influential senior sponsor or dutiful observance of training protocols, neither of which applied to him. The wayward young painter was duly eliminated in an early round, well before the finalists entered their solitary chambers to produce a finished painting in just 71 days. Here is the painting that took the honor by Antoine Jean-Baptiste Thomas, the subject being that with the same subject all the contestants would paint, set for that year, was Oenone refusing to help Paris. Now, you'll be forgiven if you don't recognize either the painter's name or the subject of this painting. The narrative, Paris is in it, so yes, it derives from the saga of the Trojan War, but draws on a very esoteric, non-Homeric source. In its account of the city's fall, the mortally wounded Paris is forced to turn for aid to his spurned first wife, the nymph Oenone of Mount Ida, which she indignantly refuses to do. But nonetheless, despite his defeat, Géricault, proudly independent, staking his claim on possessing all he needed to prevail, despite his minimal vetting, mentorship, or personal disposition to such scholastic exercises, takes himself off to Rome on his own account in September 1816, something the wealth of his family permitted him to do. Also, at the moment of his departure, other family considerations, chiefly a clandestine love affair with a woman who was his aunt by marriage, roiled his emotions probably much more than had professional disappointment. But this and other personal troubles did not impede his applying himself fully to his work when he arrived in Rome that November. There are ample numbers of sheets that support the desire of these older scholars to place Géricault under the self-imposed discipline of inherited norms. Here is one sheet with 3 views of the Belvedere torso, one of the chief glories of the Vatican Antiquities collection, and only lately in the Louvre, along the lower register, an Antinous type standing for youthful male beauty, and what appears to be some improvised extrapolation in the lower right-hand example. Traveling south, he recorded the Greek ruins at Paestum with careful rigor. While in Naples on that same excursion, he meticulously rendered the renowned bronze horse's head in the Museo Nazionale. Indeed, if we were to pose the question, who between the outsider Géricault and the groomed insider Thomas, which of the two was more likely to have fulfilled this expectation when both found themselves simultaneously in Rome that autumn? And who between them was more likely to be the disobedient scoffer at academic norms? Well, the wayward one turns out to have been Thomas. Though the nature of his disobedience differs greatly from the far more famous rebels of decades past, like Jean-Germain Drouet and Anne-Louis Girodet, who were the subjects of my own book, Emulation. Those earlier student artists chafed against the supervision of the Academy in order to pursue what each felt to be a deeper and truer commitment to the ideals of antiquity. Thomas, by contrast, went his own way in order to chronicle the local color of Rome for a travelogue-style set of documentary prints on which he labored for 5 years from his early return to Paris in 1817, that he just threw aside his fellowship, went back to Paris in order to create the album which carried this title page when he finally finished 6 years later. 1 year in Rome and its surroundings, collection of lithographic drawings representing the dress, the customs, and the civil and religious ceremonies of the Roman estates, and generally all the remarkable things one sees there over the course of a year. And each of these prints came with his own rather extensive personal commentary. Representative of these promised sites would be the album's very first print, which documents credulous devotion to an adorned wooden effigy of the Christ child, the Santo Bambino di Arcocelli, atop the penitential steps of the church on the Capitoline Hill, pointedly contrasted with the bleached monuments of antiquity and Michelangelo's stately architecture surrounding the Piazza Campidoglio. Here, the site and effigy as they exist today. The continual rounds of religious processions by eerily hooded penitents bearing sanctified effigies through the city streets would speak to French readers of medieval piety unconquered by Enlightenment skepticism, and still a pervasive force in the papal capital. His renderings, Thomas, that is, his renderings of other processions featuring similarly hooded figures, fulfilled curiosity about the morbid exercise of public execution. These two panels tracking the route from the prison of the Castel San Angelo to the headsman's scaffold in the vicinity of the Piazza del Popolo. We could thus say that the nature of Thomas' disobedience lay not so much in his precocious neglect of the classical past in favor of modern subjects, as it did in the neglect of disinterested artistic learning in favor of an overtly commercial enterprise. The recently invented medium of lithography, in which the artist need only draw in a greasy pencil on stone, enhanced both the immediacy and efficiency of the printing process, not to mention reducing its expense. These modern 19th century subjects, like the frenzied lay followers of a procession bearing a revered Madonna, and you see the lay hangers-on there, both anticipate realist tendencies of the next generation and follow from Thomas' perception of a prime business opportunity. We've been following the theme of unmaking and undoing, the tension and fractures that showed as Napoleon's authority waned. Given that Thomas was the first winner of the Grand Prix under the restored monarchy, one could hypothesize that the first wholesale unmaking of older norms lay here in this impudent indifference to high-minded, disinterested ideals by their profanation by calculating commerce. Now, Géricault would seem to be above all that. He came from relative wealth, and by the habits of polite society and a cavalryman's temperament, he would have given little thought to such expedient calculation. Also, residual bad feeling from the Rome Prize competition might also have distanced him from the calculating Thomas. But the opposite appears to have been the case. Beyond the discipline entailed in copying the great monuments, as we saw a moment before, Géricault followed Thomas with studies of his own, scores of them, depicting some of the same street scenes and events that Thomas was recording for his album of prints. In this sheet, the Madonna procession followers finding themselves piled against the door of a church that they can't enter, peeking through this small opening. The parallelism is so strong that one readily envisions them, Géricault and Thomas, working in tandem, at least some of the time. And their pattern of overlap tends to focus on one limited area of the city. That area being the northern portion of Rome inside the Aurelian Wall in the vicinity of the Piazza del Popolo. Thomas judged that the sight of mounted herdsmen from the surrounding Campagna thundering with their maddened cattle into the same piazza through its famous gate, this being the main northern entrance into the city and the central thoroughfare of the Corso, that would intrigue his Parisian readers, and I expect he was right, especially with the improvised corrida on horseback as the errant steers are goaded back into line. And here is one rendition by Géricault of more or less the same phenomenon, lent a monumentality that defies the relatively small dimensions of the sheet, just about 11 inches across. And it's an example of his developing use of white gouache to heighten the black chalk on brown paper, as in the power of this just partially visible white steer packed in among the other forms, but nonetheless seeming to burst out of those boundaries. Heightening the black chalk on brown paper, a striking technique that combines a feeling of impromptu immediacy and bold modeling of three-dimensional forms. In its resemblance to the reliefs on the side of certain Hellenistic or Roman burial sarcophagi, such an exercise could still be taken as evidence for Géricault's presumed drive to subsume these fleeting impressions of thunderous movement under the discipline of sanctioned classical prototypes. The sites of the cattle market had a nearby ritualized counterpart in the bullfights staged in the Mausoleum of Augustus, just behind the Corso and no more than a 5-minute walk from the Piazza del Popolo. Thomas devoted one print to this overall vista of the event and another to a series of isolated actions, which make much of it seem closer to the antics of rodeo clowns than to a stately Spanish corrida, except for this one in the lower left. You see one bullfighter wrestling a mammoth beast to the ground by seizing it by the horns. A spectacle transmuted by Géricault into perhaps the most astonishing and consummate drawing of his whole Roman sojourn. The powerful nude athlete forcing a bull to the ground. Now, the drawing, as is frequently observed, plainly channels ancient representations of the Persian cult deity Mithras slaying a bull, a sacrificial effigy type imported to Rome by returning soldiers and well known there via this accomplished version in the Vatican collections. But observed contemporary life in Géricault's sheet is just as evident. The entire drawing manages to overlay antiquity with the animal torments of both the market abattoir and the bullfighting arena, and does so via an internal system of transformations that requires the viewer to engage with the sheet physically as well as simply by eye. You have to read the sheet upside down, which brings into focus two vignettes that turn the great central man-animal emblem into the middle point in a temporal sequence. To the right, the athlete, unencumbered by cape, first seizes the horn of the beast. To the left, he pins the head to earth, the one visible eye of the bull going dead. Despite the 180-degree reversal of the whole drawing, there remains a strongly composed arc that launches itself from the bull's turn of head at the lower right through the large central motif, the tamer suspended like a falling rebel angel, descending like the defeated animal to the ground in the lower left. Then, last to come into view in the lower center of the upside-down sheet, I mean this right here, in distinctly and intentionally fainter lines, is a purely animal combat between two bulls. The flourish of the tail to the right, I don't think, could ever be surpassed in Draftsman's calligraphy. And that passage links the bolder vignettes into a completed cycle whereby human conquest begins and ends in the animal drive for domination. The nudity of the figure, for I think it's pretty plainly one personage, combined with the placeless background, renders the whole dynamic abstract and apparently timeless. But underneath, below a series of summary horizontal lines, a linear procession proceeds from right to left, orderly, even stately, compared to the agonistic struggles above. Riders, identified by the same pikes and hats seen in the gouache drawing we were just looking at a moment ago, take the lead and the rear of their orderly herd. The coordination between this lower band and the forms above is subtle but comprehensive, sealing a kind of circular pact between the ancient and modern models that Géricault is putting to use. He enlists what would seem at first encounter the marginalia or afterthoughts which are so often present in working drawings in a way that is by no means improvised or afterthought in character. In fact, precisely premeditated and calculated to communicate via a drawing in a way that I think is well, if not unprecedented, exceedingly rare, both before Géricault and I would say after as well. A new and deliberate mode of discursive composition. The lithograph by Thomas had played up a moment of mayhem in the driven cattle, perhaps common when the animals were forced through the narrow defile of the city gate. Géricault leaves out the sensationalized middle term in his cyclical movement between the picturesque contemporary marketplace anecdote and the arc of bare-handed battle between man and animal. But he holds in reserve an astonishing pictorial account of the final destination of the cattle in the slaughterhouse. In the lower right of this Roman drawing, Géricault essentially repeats the vignette of the male subduing the bull. Here, the nudity of sweating exertion is combined with lots of contemporary details like the hairstyle, mustache, and frothing dogs in this part. The human subjects in the drawing invite little in the way of subjective identification. They turn in profile, intent on their variously murderous tasks. I say murderous in that the intersubjective connection, much as in Goya's 2nd of May, that is the painting we spent time with in Lecture 2, similarly devolves onto the animals, all of whom in some way face and lock eyes with an implied spectator. And also in the vicinity of the Piazza del Popolo was the scaffold on which public executions took place. And Géricault makes a direct analogy between his humanly subjectivized cattle in the slaughter drawing and the parallel putting to death of human beings. This is one of a half-dozen known drawings that record his stark impressions of condemned criminals approaching the headsman's block. The executioner here stands in an apparently indifferent remove, while sinister-appearing figures in robes and hoods bundle the blindfolded victim toward his fate. Géricault thought that the suspension of that wide interval between axe and scaffold was so important that he erased a figure that he'd originally had in the middle, leaving that aching void instead. Those hooded attendant figures, these characters here, well, this one in full face with the victim's head against that baleful, spectral countenance. These signal the place of these gruesome events in the Roman calendar. The figures are members of the confraternity of the Misericordia, whose voluntary duties included accompanying and putatively comforting condemned men in their final moments. The ritual announced the onset of Roman Carnival, the weeks of license leading up to Lent. While Géricault accumulated over the course of his stay in Rome scores of drawings on a wide variety of subjects, there exists this core in his output devoted to a specific quarter of the city, centered on animals and humans undergoing physical duress, and linked to the permitted excesses of carnival season. And it was Carnival that provided Géricault with the cognate theme he settled upon as his intended subject for a major, perhaps monumental painting, the riderless horses racing down the length of the Corso. These were contests of ancient origin that took place daily during the final 8 days of Carnival, the same period when full masking was permitted by papal authorities. These events were thus closely aligned with the location and spectacle of the cattle market. Our friend Thomas devoted more than one print to the event, so large did it loom in the touristic imagination. In this one, with 2 views, the horses are shown in full flight, hurtling past the costumed revelers, then running headlong into a great curtain outside the Palazzo Venezia, after which the handlers would lunge toward their bridles in order to bring the animals under control. Now, to understand just how the horses were induced to make the run from the starting line in the Piazza del Popolo and why it was so perilous to corral them at the end, we can turn to the formidable English writer Charlotte Ann Eaton, née Waldy. She chronicled the very year of Géricault's Roman sojourn over 3 volumes published in 1820 under the title Rome in the 19th Century, containing, as the title page states, remarks on the fine arts, on the state of society, the religious ceremonies, manners, and customs on the modern Romans, end of quote. An English language verbal equivalent to Thomas' 1 year in Rome as its illustrated counterpart. In her chapter devoted to the Roman Carnival events, a humane English disapproval colors her description. Quote, "Their impetuosity in the race is not so much owing to their natural spirit as it is to the agony of the goads or balls covered with sharp spikes of metal suspended from their backs, which at every motion fall heavily on the same spot, making large, raw, gory circles over their bodies, horrible to behold. Sometimes 6 or 8 of these goads are beating their bleeding sides at once, and as if this were not torment enough, fire is likewise applied to them, so that the poor animals, furious under these tortures, often cannot be restrained by the force of 8 or 10 men, restrained from leaping the cords which confine them at the entrance of the Corso." Now, this subject in many ways must have seemed made for Géricault. More than any other, the event shifted agency as far as possible toward the animal and away from human mastery. It entailed a trial by pain and the not uncommon fatality. Of his numerous studies on the subject, this one probably comes closest to the mayhem evoked by Eaton. It flirts with chaos even more than does the starting line of Thomas. But Thomas includes one detail that his friend Géricault consistently omits throughout his series. The goads, here, for example, along the flanks and necks of the horses that spurred them to run, some of those barbs being attached to their festively ornamented headgear. The best known and probably most admired of Géricault's oil studies suppresses almost any hint of duress suffered by the horses. Indeed, its stately order fulfills all too well the old art historian's dream of a normative classical Géricault, at the expense of the intensity that had drawn him to this carnival complex of suffering and death around the Piazza del Popolo. The dark thread running through this lecture, and I'll admit it has been one, and ran through the last as well, beginning with the mayhem of Goya's Disasters of War and the paintings of the 2nd and 3rd of May, has been the responsibility on the part of any artist at this moment, aspiring toward greatness, to confront the catastrophic levels of violence and endemic cruelty visited on Europe by the onset of total warfare. No profundity would be possible without that recognition. Such memories overwhelming the conventional decorum of painted representation required other channels, which for Goya and Géricault both entailed a displacement of feeling and identification from the human to the animal. The riderless horses of the Corso, he appears to have decided, would be the one Roman subject that could engender a great painting. But none ever issued from the myriad sketches and studies devoted to the ritual, neither in Rome nor on his return to Paris late in the autumn of 1817. The demands of the medium of painting appear to have blocked the necessary confrontation with danger and suffering. In the final lecture of this series, we will catch up with Géricault on his return to Paris in order to witness his triumphant reckoning with the immensity of inherited pain and loss, while at the same time fully conquering the discipline of painting on a monumental canvas, raising a new humanity out of animal ordeals, and thereby transforming for his generation what a painting could be and what it could accomplish. But that's some time out, indeed, 4 weeks from now. In 2 weeks' time, in the next lecture on April 12th, we'll examine another artist's journey across Europe to Rome, but no young renegade this time, instead an establishment figure in the fullness of his years, the English portraitist Thomas Lawrence, charged with the still difficult task of making reaction appear heroic. With that, I will leave things for today with many, many thanks for your kind attention.
This has been a National Gallery of Art podcast.